Matthew Evans, a wealthy man in his late 70s, sat alone in his silver Mercedes, his thumb drumming impatiently against the steering wheel. The hum of the air conditioner barely kept the stifling Kentucky heat at bay. A lifetime in finance had afforded him luxury and control, but today, stranded on the side of the road with a flat tire, he found himself at the mercy of chance, far from the comfort of his immaculate mansion on the outskirts of town. After several failed attempts to call for roadside assistance, Matthew let out a frustrated sigh. Just as irritation began to take hold, he noticed a figure approaching from down the road. A young boy, no older than 13 or 14, dressed in a faded t-shirt and worn-out sneakers. There was a sense of quiet determination in the way he walked. The boy's gaze flickered toward the car, assessing the situation before offering Matthew a polite, yet confident nod. "Got a flat, sir?" he asked, his voice calm. Matthew exhaled, feeling an odd mix of relief and uncertainty. "Yes, I do," he admitted. "Tried calling for help, but there's no signal out here." The boy gave a small, knowing smile. "I can fix that," he said, kneeling beside the tire without hesitation. "My grandpa taught me how to change one last summer. You got a spare?" Matthew gestured toward the trunk, watching as the boy retrieved the tools and got to work. His hands moved with an efficiency beyond his years, his focus unwavering. Standing there, Matthew felt an unfamiliar sense of humility creeping in, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. He wanted to repay the boy somehow, but the kid hardly looked up, completely absorbed in the task. Within minutes, the job was done. The boy wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped back, nodding with quiet satisfaction. "All set," he said simply. Matthew pulled out his wallet, fishing for a few bills. Holding them out, he said, "Here, take this. I really appreciate the help." But the boy took a step back, raising a hand politely. "Thank you, sir, but I don't need anything. Just glad I could help." Matthew stood there, stunned, money still in his hand, as he watched the boy turn and continue down the road. The brief encounter left him unsettled, though he couldn't quite understand why. Slowly, he slid the bills back into his wallet and climbed into his car. As he drove, his thoughts kept drifting back to the boy. There was a quiet dignity in him, a self-assurance that had nothing to do with wealth or privilege, something deeper, something rare. That evening, Matthew sat in his leather armchair, surrounded by shelves of books he rarely touched. The room was still, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. His dinner, a perfectly cooked steak with asparagus, sat untouched on the side table. He had met thousands of people in his lifetime, business partners, employees, investors. Every interaction had always been a transaction, an exchange of value, favors, or negotiations. Yet today, for the first time in a long while, he had encountered something different. Kindness, given freely, with no expectation in return. And he couldn't shake the feeling that it meant more than he had ever realized. A price or an expectation, that was how the world worked. Yet this boy, a complete stranger, had helped him without asking for anything in return. Matthew leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip of his scotch. The boy's confident smile replayed in his mind, lingering longer than he expected. He didn't look like someone who had much. The worn sneakers, the faded shirt, the dust on his hands, they all told a story. And yet, despite everything, he carried himself with a quiet dignity, an integrity that felt rare in the world Matthew knew. The next morning, an unfamiliar restlessness stirred inside him. He couldn't explain why, but something about the encounter felt unfinished. Guilt, gratitude, maybe just curiosity. Whatever it was, he found himself driving down the same stretch of road, scanning for any sign of the boy. Hours passed as he stopped at gas stations and small diners, asking anyone who would listen if they'd seen a boy matching the description. Most just shrugged or shook their heads, until finally, at a small roadside cafe, an older woman behind the counter spoke up. "Sounds like you're talking about Elijah," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "That boy's always helping folks around here. Lives with his mama over in Harlan." "Harlan?" Matthew repeated, committing the name to memory. "Thank you. The town was an hour away, nestled in the rolling foothills of the Appalachians. The drive was beautiful, but Matthew barely noticed. His mind raced with questions. What kind of life did this boy have? What kind of family raised someone like that? When he arrived in Harlan, the streets were quiet, lined with small houses and local businesses. Asking around, he was eventually pointed to a modest home on the edge of town. It was worn but well kept, its front porch sagging slightly under its own weight. Matthew parked and hesitated for a moment. What was he even going to say? Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. A woman in her early 40s answered, her expression wary yet kind. Her eyes, sharp with curiosity, studied him for a moment. "Can I help you?" she asked. Matthew cleared his throat. "Good morning. I'm sorry to bother you, but I believe I met your son yesterday. Elijah, right? He helped me with a flat tire." At the mention of her son, her face softened. "That sounds like my Elijah," she said with a small, knowing smile. "He's always helping folks." Matthew nodded. "I wanted to thank him properly. He wouldn't accept anything from me yesterday." She stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. "He's out back. You're welcome to wait." Stepping inside, Matthew took in the surroundings. The home was simple, the furniture old but cared for. Family photos lined the walls, and among them were crayon drawings that must have belonged to a much younger Elijah. It was a stark contrast to Matthew's own house, grand, pristine, filled with expensive artwork. Yet somehow, this space felt warmer, more alive. Following her through the house, they stepped outside into the backyard. There, Elijah was repairing a section of the fence, his hands steady, his focus unwavering. When he looked up and saw Matthew, surprise flickered across his face. "Hey, mister," Elijah said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What are you doing here?" Matthew smiled, suddenly feeling a little nervous. "I wanted to thank you again." "You helped me when I really needed it," Matthew said, his voice unusually soft, "and I just couldn't stop thinking about it." Elijah shrugged, his expression easy and genuine. It wasn't a big deal. But to Matthew it was. He was determined to make that clear. Elijah leaned against the fence, his curious gaze fixed on Matthew. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Something about the boy's calmness made Matthew feel slightly out of place, almost as if he were the one being examined. "I don't think you realize what a big deal it was," Matthew finally said, breaking the silence. "People don't usually help strangers without expecting something in return." Elijah tilted his head slightly, as if the idea itself was foreign to him. "I don't see it like that," he replied. "If someone needs help and I can do it, why wouldn't I?" The simplicity of the boy's logic struck Matthew harder than he expected. He glanced past Elijah at the yard. The fence was patched together with mismatched wood, the grass uneven and sparse. Behind the house, an old swing set leaned at an angle, its chains rusted and broken. It was clear Elijah's family didn't have much, yet they made do with what they had. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," Matthew said, and he meant it. "Your mother must be proud." Elijah grinned, glancing toward the house. "She works hard. I just try to help out where I can." Matthew was quiet for a moment, letting the words settle. His mind drifted to his own childhood. Growing up in a house much like this one, his parents had worked tirelessly to make ends meet, teaching him the value of hard work and perseverance. Over the years, he had lost sight of those lessons, consumed by the pursuit of wealth and status. Now, swinging here in Elijah's yard, nostalgia and regret washed over him in equal measure. "I'd like to do something for you and your family," he said at last. Elijah straightened, his expression turning cautious. "We're okay, mister. We don't need anything." "It's not about need," Matthew insisted. "It's about what's right. You helped me, and I'd like to return the favor." Before Elijah could respond, the screen door creaked open. His mother stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Elijah, you better come inside and wash up before lunch," she called. Then her gaze shifted to Matthew. "Would you care to join us?" "It's nothing fancy, but you're welcome." Matthew hesitated. He wasn't used to invitations like this, simple, unpretentious, given without expectation. But the sincerity in her voice left him no room for excuses. "I'd like that," he said. Inside, the kitchen smelled of freshly baked bread and roasted vegetables. The table was small, surrounded by mismatched chairs, but it was set with care. Matthew took a seat, acutely aware of how out of place he looked in his tailored suit amid such humble surroundings. Elijah washed his hands at the sink and joined them, his easy smile never faltering. As they ate, the conversation flowed naturally. Elijah spoke about school, his friends, his dream of becoming an engineer. His mother shared stories about the community, about neighbors who looked out for each other. Matthew listened, drawn in by the warmth of it all. For years, he had surrounded himself with luxury, but his grand home now felt cold in comparison to this modest house, filled with laughter and genuine connection. After lunch, as they cleared the table, Matthew turned to Elijah's mother. "You've done a remarkable job raising him," he said sincerely. "He's got more heart than most people I know." He became consumed by wealth and status. By the time the renovations were complete, Elijah's home looked almost unrecognizable. The sagging porch had been replaced with sturdy wood, the leaky roof now stood strong, and the backyard swing set gleamed like new. Inside, fresh paint brightened the walls, the kitchen sparkled with modern appliances, and the floors shone as if they had never known wear. On the final day, Matthew gathered Elijah and his mother on the porch. "This isn't just about fixing a house," he said, looking between them. "It's about making sure you have the stability to keep thriving." Elijah's mother wiped her eyes, overwhelmed but grateful. "I don't know how to thank you." Matthew smiled, shaking his head. "You already have." Elijah stood quietly, his eyes filled with something deeper than gratitude, understanding. "You know, Mr. Evans," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I think I get it now. Helping people. It's not just about fixing things. It's about making sure they know they're not alone." Matthew felt a lump rise in his throat. He placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "You figured that out at 13. Took me a lifetime." They stood there for a while, just taking in the moment. No contracts, no deals, just the simple, quiet power of human kindness. As Matthew drove away that evening, he didn't feel like the wealthy businessman who had spent his life chasing success. He felt something more. For the first time in years, he felt whole. "You know, Mr. Evans," Elijah said, his voice steady but filled with curiosity, "what are you going to do now?" Matthew exhaled slowly, letting the question settle. It was a simple one, yet it carried more weight than any business deal he had ever negotiated. "I don't know yet," he admitted, glancing at the sky painted in shades of gold and crimson. "But I think I want to do more of this. Helping, building, making a difference where it actually matters." Elijah grinned. "That sounds like a pretty good plan." Matthew chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Coming from you, I'll take that as a solid endorsement." Elijah's mother watched the exchange with quiet warmth. "No matter what you decide," she said, "you'll always have a place at our table." Matthew felt something tighten in his chest. Not sadness, but something close to it. A longing, perhaps, for the kind of connection he had spent a lifetime pushing aside. As the evening cooled and the first stars blinked to life, Matthew stayed a little longer, letting the warmth of the moment sink in. The once stranded businessman, who had spent his days in a world of numbers and transactions, had found something no amount of wealth could buy: purpose, belonging, and the undeniable truth that the greatest investments weren't found in bank accounts, but in people. For the first time in a long time, Matthew Evans wasn't thinking about the future. He was simply enjoying the present. "Mr. Matthew," Elijah began, his voice thoughtful, "I've been thinking a lot about what you did for us. One day I want to do something like that. I want to help people too." Matthew placed a firm yet gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, his gaze steady. "You already are, Elijah. Your kindness set all of this in motion. Never lose that." The three of them sat together, watching as the sky melted from golden hues into deep shades of orange. The warmth of the evening lingered, but an even deeper warmth surrounded them, the kind that came from human connection, gratitude, and a shared sense of purpose. When it was time for Matthew to leave, Elijah and his mother walked him to his car. The boy's bright, genuine smile and his mother's tear-filled eyes were etched into Matthew's memory as he drove away. He realized then this wasn't an ending. It was the start of something new for all of them. In the weeks that followed, Elijah's curiosity about construction grew into a real passion. Noticing this, Matthew arranged for him to spend time with the workers who had rebuilt their home. Elijah absorbed every detail, eager to learn and practice. At the same time, Matthew found himself returning to Harlan again and again. Each visit felt less like a trip and more like coming home. He no longer felt like an outsider in their lives. He was part of something meaningful now, and for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. The story came full circle in a town filled with heart, where one simple act of kindness from a young boy had reminded an old man of life's greatest truth. It's not about what you own, it's about what you give.